Okay, hello and welcome to this video in the GCSE Ecosystems and Environment topic, and we're getting into the very last bits of the GCSE here, and I think we've saved the most important bit until last, and that is the bit about food. Okay, so the next few sessions are going to be on various aspects of food production and the food we eat, and really what could be more important. Now, I am a massive believer in the importance and the value of food, both biologically, nutritionally and culturally, in terms of all the things that we do ultimately revolve around the food that we eat and what could be more important. And when you start messing with the food that we eat, we start to get, shall we say, some interesting problems. Okay, so we're going to discuss all sorts of things from animal cruelty through to vegetarianism, veganism, all sorts of different things, and where our food comes from. And I'm hoping not just will we cover this bit of syllabus here, we're going to go through each of these bullet points in this video, but we'll get a better understanding of being a bit more conscious, right, about the food we eat. In fact, I went shopping after writing this video yesterday, and every time I do these lessons, I always come away thinking just a little bit harder about the food that I buy, and I really try and make sure that I'm eating as ethically as I can within, obviously, limits of practicality. Okay, so what it's looking for here, students should be able to describe one of the biological factors affecting levels of food security, what food security is, and the factors that can affect it, like the population growth. We're not going to spend long on that because we already talked about it. Changing diets, new pests, environmental changes, the cost of agricultural inputs, conflicts, and then obviously the idea that that line at the bottom there pretty stating the obvious. We need to find sustainable ways to feed all the people on the planet, or else we're going to have serious humanitarian problems. So, start with a definition. It's pretty obvious what food security means. So food security means having reliable access to a sufficient quantity of affordable, nutritious food. Now, according to the World Health Organization, 820 million people on this planet live in hunger, don't have enough food day to day, and that was a pre-pandemic number. Pandemic will obviously have made that a bit worse in a lot of places. That's about 10%, approximately rounds to 10% of the world's population simply don't have enough food for the reasons that we're going to discuss. Okay, now obviously food security is not an issue that just affects poor areas. The pandemic has shown us that food security affects rich areas as well. Do we all remember the fun of the panic buying and the shortages of things in lockdown number 1 because of people buying huge amounts of stuff, stockpiling it, hoarding it, all that kind of stuff, and of course the problems that the supermarkets then had with their very thin and last minute sort of supply chains in replacing all that material. Okay, loo roll and yeast being the things that people went for. Not sure what they were doing with those two things, but there we go. Okay, and obviously everyone became a nation of bread bakers, so flour ran out. Okay, right, so first problem we're going to address is the population. Okay, we've done a video on this. I'm not going to go into why the population is changing, just it is. You can watch that video if you want. Population increase. Okay, the other issue is that not only is the population getting bigger, but large proportions of it are getting wealthier. Okay, now that obviously is a good thing. We're bringing people out of poverty, but what it does do is it changes the way people eat. It makes more people want to eat like the rich people, okay, which again is completely understandable, but what we need to do is make sure that what they're eating is actually sustainable. Okay, regardless of wealth. So to give you some graphs, and this is all taken from a BBC article that I found that's taken their information from the UN Food Agriculture Organization. So you can look at the link in the description for the references to this. This is basically how much meat, and we are going to look at meat here because it's seen globally as quite a luxury food. Okay, a lot of people, if you've got access to meat, that's seen as quite a wealthy diet. Okay, especially if you can have meat every day, you're seen as very wealthy on a global context. So we're going to look at meat as the example here. Right, so meat production by region, as you can see, since 1961 has gone up and up, with most of that being driven by Asia. So if you look at 1960s, how much meat was being consumed in Asia in terms of tons, we were looking right down here, less than 50 million tons, and now we're up well above 100 million tons. So Europe has obviously gone up and down, remained a bit static there, but obviously there was a lot of meat being eaten in Europe. North America, as you can see, has started quite large and has got even bigger, right, in the post-war period. South America, driven by places like Argentina, being increasing in wealth and obviously being massively big on their meat in Argentina, has driven that as well. And as you can see, everywhere has gone up. Now, if you remember from the population video, population increase over the next half century is probably going to be all in Africa, so we can start to see a trend in Africa there in increasing meat consumption. Now, is this sustainable, right? So who currently is eating the most meat? Well, this is not really a surprise that it's the wealthier nations. So the ones that are sort of there 100 to 153 kilograms per person per year. So the biggest eaters there you can see are the USA, right? You can see Australia and you can see Argentina, right? That are huge meat consumers. We're not far behind in the 50 to 100 category, as is places like Russia, and now China is in that group as well. Look where we're not getting a lot of meat being eaten. Okay, obviously the grey areas are no data available, right? We've got a lot of growth to come if we don't change our diets radically in Africa, okay? Now, who's driving this? As you can see, look, the places that are really on and up have been China and Brazil since the 1970s, 80s, and these are countries that have seen big increases in wealth, as I say. US has gone up, but stayed reasonably static. UK, reasonably static. Canada, gone up really static, that kind of thing. Kenya and India. Now, India is an interesting one. Obviously, the population has increased massively. The wealth has increased massively in that period of time. But you've got a dominant religion there that generally has an awful lot of vegetarianism in it. Okay, so India's meat consumption has remained very, very low. Okay, so that's one problem. Okay, you've got an increasing population eating more like the rich people. You've also got another problem in terms of food security, in terms of how much food is imported. Now, this is from our context in the UK, from the gov.uk website, in terms of how much of our food comes in from another country. So 55% of the food that we eat is homegrown. Okay, that's good, but obviously that means that 45% isn't. Okay, more than a quarter comes in from the EU, right? Obviously you can think what stupid geopolitical decision that we've made recently that will make that harder. And then obviously you've got more things coming, you've got 4% coming from Africa, North America, South America, Asia, the rest of Europe, so on and so forth, and 1% from Australia, okay, and Australasia, largely things like New Zealand lamb, right, coming in from there. But that basically means that if we suddenly overnight had to cut our food consumption by 45% as a country, right, it would be a very, very, very difficult thing to do, and a lot of people would go hungry, okay? And that is what we mean by food security. Why are we importing this much food? Well, let's break it down into the different areas of what we import and what we export, okay? Now, this is looking in terms of money, right? Fruit and veg wise, we import huge quantities of fruit and veg. We export very little. So 11.5 billion pounds worth, 1.3 billion going out. Broadly speaking, that is potatoes. They are one of the few vegetables that we in the British Isles export more than we import, right? We actually have a surplus of potatoes. A lot of other things come in from large fruit and veg growing places in the south of Spain and so on and so forth, right? Meat, we're importing a lot more of that, more on meat in a little while. The only one where we've got a surplus here in terms of money is beverages, so alcohol, so drinks, particularly alcoholic drinks, and particularly Scotch whisky contributes to that as well, which is seen a premium brand all around the world. As you can see, the rest of these we are running, we're importing far more than we're exporting, which means we are dependent on other countries largely for our food, okay, or to a significant degree for our food. That's not a very secure way to carry on, right? So why do we eat like this? Why do we shop like this? We never used to. Okay, what's changed since that sort of 60s, 50s era that's made us sort of have such a different way of eating? Well, we've lost a lot of knowledge, okay, I would say. We've lost an awful lot of cooking, food and culinary knowledge, right? As convenience food came in through the 60s, 70s, 80s, the sort of ready meals, the TV dinners, all that kind of era, we lost a lot of knowledge, okay? If you talk to your grandparents, you talk to the older members of the population, the wealth of knowledge they've got about creating and cooking food is absolutely staggering. You know, get your parents' old cookbooks, get your grandparents' old cookbooks. There's a wealth of knowledge in them, right, of things you can do with the things around you. Convenience, of course, more people are having jobs that are taking them away from home more often. You've got more households where lots and lots of people are, everyone's working and no one's got time to cook, which obviously you could argue is a good thing and a bad thing, right? It depends how you do it, of course. Demand for the same choice all year round is the same thing. So if you want this particular fruit or vegetable any time of the year, we can have it now. We'll just fly it in from South America. That's fine, okay? And demands on price. Our food retail market is dominated by the supermarkets, and they basically say to farmers, "Well, we're the only game in town. We're going to pay you this for your crop." and because we can sell it to our customers for this price, which is cheaper than the other guys. And the farmers will go, well, that's not enough for us to make a decent quality product. It's not enough for us to produce the food at that standard. And they go, well, who else are you going to sell it to, right? We're the supermarkets. We do the majority of the retail in the country. So the demand on price has pushed the sort of also the quality of the food and the incentive to farm in this country down and down and down and down and down. And we should be respecting our farmers and valuing their products more than we are. On that note, right, we actually spend a tiny fraction of our income compared to other countries on food, okay? And for something that's that important, food is how we live, right? For something that is this important, that is a very, very, very small amount of money we spend on our food, okay? As you can see, the only country that spends less money as a proportion of their income is the USA. And the food in the USA, you might have seen in the news with chlorinated chicken and hormone beef and all that kind of stuff, is something we really don't want imported into this country. So what happens if you push the price of food down, the quality goes down, okay? As you can see, as you go up there, you've got various other countries that spend a huge proportion. We're actually spending most of our income on housing and accommodation, okay? Which for me is the wrong way around. Okay, we should be valuing our food. We should be making sure that farmers get a living wage, that they can actually produce a quality product that we buy and cook and eat. Okay, so as I say, this is the sort of the other things that we spend our money on. As you can see, in the UK, we spend a huge amount of money on our housing. Right, compared to 1957, that's gone up, and the amount we've spent on food has come down and down and down. So as you can see, this box here shows you in the light one, 1957's percentage on food and 2017's family spend on food. And that again is the effect of our supermarkets. Okay, so when you put this together, so we've said population, we've said wealth. Right, so we're going to put these two together, okay? And what does that do to food security overall, right? Well, if you look at this on a global scale, right? If you've got a growing population, particularly in Asia, you've got growing wealth and therefore demand for things like meat. You can't necessarily produce the types of food that people want to eat in the places where they are. So you end up importing, and particularly importing feed for livestock. So that's where soybeans come in. Now, soybeans are incredibly environmentally damaging, or the soybean trade is incredibly environmentally damaging, right? So this is imports of soybean meal, right? Which is a perfectly human edible protein, which tends to get fed to livestock, which then gets slaughtered and sold to humans as food, okay? Now that obviously you might think is a crazy way of doing things, and we'll look at that when we look at productivity in food production in the next video, okay? So there's this measure you might have heard of, right, where you should really be thinking about this when you're buying your food. I try to. It's not always easy with what's available. Where's your food come from? All right, so food miles are the distance that the food has travelled to get to you. It's got both carbon implications, see carbon cycle and global warming video, if you've had to fly it around the world or bring it on a boat, and security. What if we suddenly fall out with that country, or we spend the last 5 years trying to antagonise our neighbours and interrupt trade there, right? We've got both carbon and security consequences that are quite negative. So if we're not reliant on our own food, it's a bit of a problem. Okay, so think about your food miles. Now I'll give you an example here. During the summer, where small weddings were allowed, some very good friends of mine and my wife's got married. Okay, and we couldn't go to the wedding because, of course, they were limited to sort of 6 or 12 people. Okay, so I decided to recreate their wedding meal, and we had like a satellite wedding where we did all the same things as them. Now, they sent us the menu and I recreated it, and here it is. Okay, as you can see, beef done 2 ways, mash, vegetables, gravy, that kind of stuff. Now, the food miles for this I was particularly impressed with because the beef was from our local butcher who could tell me exactly where the cows came from. Okay, it's very, very close to where I live. The kale there, as you can see, was grown in the garden, as were the potatoes, as were the carrots, my lovely purple carrots there, and the onions. Okay, so the food miles, most of that came from my back garden or the beef farm just down the road. Okay, now obviously that's a special occasion, special occasion type of meal, but it's good to consider. I felt very proud of that the food miles were so low. Essentially, I'd taken carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere around my house and turned it into food via the medium of plants. Okay, absolutely brilliant, right? Now, if you don't think that this food miles thing is mad and you think, oh, it's fine, you just export and import things, whatever, we're not going to go to war with anyone tomorrow. Let me give you this weird thing called carcass balance. if you've got a pig in the UK, right, and you slaughtered the pig, right, for food, we have a very, very strange thing where people are so picky and so choosy about the cuts of meat that they want, that what we end up doing is we end up taking that pig, cutting it in half, we end up exporting more front halves of pig, right, to France, and importing more back halves of pig from France, because the cuts that the British will buy tend to be the things from the back end, okay? Because people know what to do with a chop or a steak or some mince, right? They don't necessarily know what to do with chump or brisket or neck or shin, right, or cheek, right, of cow or pig, right? So what we end up with is this mad trade of bits of meat. Essentially the same. So pork is all the same stuff. It's coming from France because it's the cut that people like, and bits from the UK are going over there because the bits they like, right? Absolutely mad. And it's an education thing, right? Learn to cook, right? All of this stuff is brilliant. Value your food, okay? Value where it comes from. Right? And obviously the British Meat Processors Association here warned that unless retailers reinstate their full range of meat products, there'll be an abundance of other cuts leading to falling prices for producers and lots of our farmers going out of business. And that's not okay. Right? So there's other examples as well, famously. You can look into Danish bacon, this idea that in the UK we have quite stringent rules, rightly, on welfare, more on that in a moment, but we actually import meat from other places. So you end up with two types of meat from two different countries on the shelf of the supermarket next to each other, and the British one's more expensive. So people go, the Danish bacon being an example. But their standards of welfare are much lower than ours. They can get away, or legally, with doing things to their pigs, keeping their pigs in systems that aren't allowed in the UK. It puts our farmers at a disadvantage. Now, if everybody knew that, they knew what went on, they wouldn't want the Danish bacon. Go look into it yourself. New Zealand lamb. How can it possibly be cheaper to fly or sail lamb from the other side of the planet, right, to the UK, when we have huge flocks of sheep here? Okay, that's absolutely insane. And the reason being, New Zealand's got a climate where they can grow sheep, or they can basically rear sheep all year round. We have seasonality here, which basically means that their production, right, and they've got more land, more space, more unoccupied land for grazing, for pasture, which means their production actually ends up cheaper. But that's insane. Right? Why am I eating a lamb from the other side of the world where the farmer next door is going out of business? Madness. And again, there's lots of other examples of where imports of food come from other lower welfare systems than what we've got, where buying a British product would be better for food miles and for welfare. But the minute you start as a government saying, well, we're not going to have your food, right, we're not going to buy that food because it doesn't meet our standards, well, then they go, okay, we're going to retaliate with something else. We're not going to buy your cars or your whatever. And then you've got a trade war, okay? And this is some of the many, many problems with negotiating trade deals around the world, right? So anyway, that's basically population, consumer choice, and wealth covered. Let's move on to pests, okay? So pests attack crops, of course. They reduce yield, and global transport moves them around, okay? Biosecurity, very, very important. I'll give you an example. This thing here, this is from last week or a couple of weeks ago. So UK scientists confirmed the arrival of brown marmotted stink bugs into the UK. And these are crop pests, okay? It's a very, very, very big problem, certainly with soft fruit growing. And Britain is brilliant at growing apples, okay? We have a huge amount of orchards, and we are absolutely brilliant at apples. And these things are particularly nasty at stopping apples from ripening and putting nasty marks in them and so on and so forth, right? So, and the suggestion is they hitched a ride in on packing crates. There are other really famous examples like this, the cane beetle and the cane toad in Australia, where when sugarcane was moved into Australia to grow in great plantations, the native cane beetle went yum yum yum, that's very nice, and started predating on it. So a predator from Central America was found, the cane toad, which was then introduced into Australia, which went absolutely mad eating the native animals, the native wildlife. And of course they produce a toxin to which lots of marsupials and other Australian fauna is not resistant to, so lots of things get poisoned. And there's still a huge problem with cane toads now in Australia. All the beetle did was just move slightly higher up the sugar cane than the cane toads could reach. So it didn't solve the original problem. Okay, and this is what happens when you introduce a pest into an environment, or when you mess with invasive species. Okay? In fact, this example is so famous that it even made an episode of The Simpsons, Bart versus Australia, where they showed this idea of releasing it was a bullfrog in his instance, which basically was clearly a nod towards the cane toad situation coming from the Americas into Australia. Right, anyway, let's move on to the next bullet point on the syllabus, which is climate change. We've discussed climate change in a previous video. You can go and watch that. How does it affect food? Well, it causes drought, it causes crop failure causes starvation and resource shortage causes war and conflict, which is also a point on your syllabus. So, to give you an example, probably the most famous example of a country ravaged by starvation and drought is Ethiopia. It's one of the first news stories I was ever aware of. Obviously not at the time, 1984, I would have been one. But obviously after that, I was aware that Ethiopia had suffered an incredible starvation, world-famous famine in 1984, and then obviously and again more recently in 2015 and again in 2021 because of changes to the climate, because of drought, and Ethiopia, Somalia and Kenya are scheduled with new forecasting modelling methods to suffer a huge drought and crop failure this year. This is from a piece in Nature by this guy who has the best scientist name in the world, Chris Funk, right, amazing name. He has written an article on this which I read, and obviously it's absolutely heartbreaking. Here's the link's in the description. Here's a little section from it. Every 5 years or so, it rips me apart to watch the same tragedy. La Nina weather cycle, you might have heard of El Nino, this is another version. Cycle brings devastation, drought and hunger to East Africa, threatening the lives and livelihoods of millions of people in Ethiopia, Somalia and Kenya. And using climate models and Earth observations, we can now predict these droughts. Once again, dry conditions are predicted from this month until December, with a very good chance of another poor rainy season in March to May 2021. Okay, so that's that point. So what do we do? How do we do this? Well, we basically share knowledge. Better farm. There's lots of great projects going on sharing European farming knowledge in Africa, right, to increase their resilience and increase their farming productivity. Public awareness of where their food comes from. You need to take this seriously. You need to be aware of where your food comes from. You need to care about it, right? It's important. Okay, it's the food you eat. Okay, and what could be more so? Okay, and here's a really good example of someone who is possibly the most important person you've never heard of. Okay, this guy called Norman Borlaug. Okay, now he is the reason, really single-handedly, I would argue, why we can currently have a planet that can sustain 7 billion people. Right? Before the 1960s, India would go through famine. Places like India, Pakistan, Mexico would go through famines quite regularly because there's only so big you can make a full-sized wheat plant, because it's the seeds you eat, bear in mind. There's only so big you can make those seeds before the wind comes and knocks them all over. Okay? Norman Borlaug, through a series of experiments and various breeding things, which he did basically on his own in a little place in Mexico because he couldn't get funding for it, worked out how to cross sort of high-yielding wheat with an Asian dwarf wheat, so made the plant much shorter, so that he could actually generate a plant that would have huge great ears of corn on it, huge great ears of wheat on it, massive seeds, and not fall over in the wind. This was part of what was called the post-World War II Green Revolution, which increased yields massively across the world and allowed crop yields to go up and people to stop starving. Okay, so obviously he saved an awful lot of lives. If you look at the wheat yields in countries from 1950 to 2004, Mexico, India and Pakistan, where dwarf wheat was introduced, right, you can actually see the huge impact this man had. And obviously he won Nobel Prizes for it, but he was very, very modest. He just wanted to make sure that people had enough food, which is why you've never heard of him. He never sought fame, he never sought accolade for it, an absolute bastion of brilliant biological science. Okay, and he saved lives just using short plants. Fantastic. So there is a bad side to the Green Revolution. It obviously meant not only intensification using varieties of crop, but also pesticides and fertilizers. And we now know that intensive use of pesticides and fertilizers over the long time degrades soil, degrades the land, and leads to massive reduction in soil health. So you can see this is the UK. This is from Game and Wildlife research page. You can see this one, again, links in the description. You can see here we've got the use of herbicides, fungicides and insecticides in the UK from 1970 up to 2005. Now they are dropping off a bit now, but all this chemical, all this external chemical input onto the land has massively reduced the flora, the sort of the health of the soil, which means that the soil then can't regenerate and can't give us those natural benefits that it would anyway. Now, there's one place, Nip Valley Park, which is down south of London, which you can actually go to, which is actually doing a radical experiment that's in this book here called Wilding, where a family who had been dairy farmers, cattle farmers for decades, generations, right, actually went, no, we're not getting any money for this. This is becoming so hard to do because the soil quality is dropping so far. It's becoming so difficult to make this productive. We're going to go completely the other way. We're going to completely rewild this site. Okay, and this book is a sort of description of what they did and the amazing return of wildlife to this area. And there is actually a project you can go to as GCSE students this summer down at Net Park with an organisation called Operation Wallacea. You can go and see. You can go and basically stay and work with scientists on that site, all in a completely COVID secure and COVID insured way. So do look into that, Operation Wallacea, if you are interested in this area of science. Okay, so the take home before we finish for me is buy local. Okay, value quality food, value the work that goes into it, learn to cook, right? It's the most useful skill you could have. I do all the cooking in our house. One, because I think it's really important, and two, because if my wife ever leaves me, she'll starve. So work with the seasons, of course, right? Don't expect to be able to have every single thing all the time. If you've got strawberries in the middle of winter, well, where have they had to come from? And really importantly, this here is a picture of one of my sets of raised beds at home with the remains. I took this just a couple of days ago with the remains of my winter crops in under my cold frames. I've got the lids up at the moment. Grow stuff, engage, get involved. You'll find nothing quite so mindful and satisfying as gardening. But more on that in the next video on food production. As I say, there's a lot of references that went into this video. All of these are in the description below. So do follow up if you want to find out more about anything I've said. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.